So a couple weeks ago, we already began talking about gender, and of course, I think the first thing we talked about was that, of course, Gnosticism sees God as okay. Anyway, so I was saying that obviously God, the one true God, right, the source of being, is seen as a force that transcends gender, and ultimately that God is beyond categories of gender. But at the same time, gender is very formative of our human experience. So just like God, in an absolute sense, can't be contained in words, but we still have to approach God through language, right? Myths and stories and theology, which is all sort of creating analogies about God. Similarly, we have to approach God or find some way to approach God through gender. And traditionally, of course, there's been this hyper-masculinization of God, in which God has been primarily confined to male attributes, right? The Father, the Son, or, God is the sort of old bearded guy of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or God is as Superman, shooting down fire from the sky and destroying people and stuff. But Gnosticism works to change this image, and not to destroy the male imagery or the image of the father or the brother, but rather to complement it with female imagery as well, so that we understand that in some sense our relationship to God is like a mother and a father, like a lover and the beloved, a brother and a sister. So it's sort of a complementarity to the relationship. So what I want to talk about tonight, though, is basically the metaphysical meaning of gender itself, though. I'm going to leave the question of God alone for this evening and talk about our own experiences of gender and what the spiritual significance of those things might be. I think we begin from a Gnostic perspective by suggesting that gender arises out of the cosmos, right, out of the material reality, or the physical reality. And like other dualities, right, good, evil, light, dark, right, left, these are seen as being actually the constituent parts of materiality. It's these dualities and these divisions and separations that are what make the material what it is and create the limitations that we associate with physical reality. And of these limitations, it is probably gender that Gnosticism sees as the most traumatic one of all. Well, except maybe the good-evil dichotomy. But the division of male and female, the gender division is very traumatic in a lot of ways. It's been a sort of division of the wholeness of the spirit into two separate pieces. And as a result, it can often lead to very self-destructive behavior, because all too often when we adhere to the gender identity that we are taught to display and taught to see in ourselves, and we don't find a way to pursue the complementary aspects of the spirit, then we quickly descend into patterns of abuse and dependence and domination that are really devoid of the true spiritual connection. So one of the goals of gnosis is, I think, to heal and overcome and transcend these kind of dualities and divisions in human experience. And thus the question of gender and the question of how we heal the brokenness that is sort of implicit in it is stressed in the Gospel of Thomas, especially saying 22, where it says, Jesus saw infants being fed, being nursed, and he said to his disciples, these infants being nursed are like those who enter the kingdom. And they said to him, shall we then as children enter the kingdom? And Jesus said in reply, when you make the two into one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male, nor the female female. And when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in the place of a hand, and a foot in the place of a foot, and a likeness in place of the likeness, then you will enter the kingdom. So, when we look at this question of what needs healing and reconciliation, the issue, the problem, is that we've been taught and conditioned, not just in our own lifetimes, but over generations of humanity, to ascribe huge importance to really minor biological differences, and not really to seek to expand our consciousness in this area, to assume that we are locked into this duality and there's no way to begin to transcend it. So what Gnosticism argues is that, in fact, each of us has a spiritual identity, and it is the spiritual identity that can lead us on a path back to wholeness. This is because there is the idea that even though we live in a very divided and sometimes painful experience in the physical world, the spirit has what the Gnostic teacher Carpocrates would call a kind of deep spiritual memory. And this is the word he uses, a spiritual memory. The most famous place where he talks about what this memory is when he makes his Christological statement about Jesus and says, which we probably talked about in other contexts, that Jesus is a man like any other man, the son of Joseph, except he was different from other people in that his mind, pure and clear, could remember, right, could exercise memory of what it had seen in the realm of the ungenerated God. So if Jesus is a great model for what we can attain, then through gnosis we believe we too can access these spiritual memories of what was in the realm of the ungenerated God, to use Carpocrates' term. And these memories, as they were, are of a wholeness, a unity. Indeed, not a cessation of our individual existences, but rather, as it were, a completion of them. And part of this spiritual memory of wholeness, beyond the divisions of gender, is part of what makes up this spiritual memory. And it is in this sense, I think, that the Gospel of Thomas puts this question as central to the idea of what is going to bring us into what the Gospel calls the kingdom. And of course, it's important to add here that the Gospel of Philip makes very clear that not only is this kind of unity, the pleroma, right, the fullness, is not only our destiny as spiritual beings, but also, in the words of the Gospel of Philip, our earliest origin, right, the earliest origin of things. So there is some way in which this wholeness of the pleroma is imprinted on our spirits, right, the pneuma, or the breath that gives us life, or rather that makes us human, and that we can sort of access those memories that are imprinted on us, but it's something that takes time because we're held back from them by other things. So when we begin to pursue through gnosis a kind of healing and wholeness toward the question of gender, a number of things begin to happen in our lives and in the way we experience the world. First of all, we begin to revolutionize the ways in which we relate to others, especially those of the other gender, or to use the more common term, the opposite sex. And really what happens is that what begins to change is that instead of seeing them as, right, quote, the opposite sex, as something to be possessed or owned or intimidated or feared or dominated by in an unhealthy way, we can begin to construct relationships with those of other genders in a way that really engage on a true human level and seek in those of another gender answers to how we can begin to complete our own spiritual existence. And in this sense, I think that relationships between men and women are very important because they have so much to teach us about this completeness, this wholeness, and what it might look like. We are in many ways forces of revelation to each other, allowing us to open up the mysteries of the hidden things concealed in those visible, to use the words of the Gospel of Philip. Or to return to the Gospel of Thomas, as Jesus says, the person of light lights up the whole world, right? In other words, we are each other's lights. And these places of spiritual memory of wholeness are sometimes shrouded in a kind of darkness of ignorance, and through the light provided by other people we can begin to see the contours of their meaning. So I think there is an importance for anyone pursuing the Gnostic path to attain a certain degree of intimacy with people of the opposite sex. Now, what I want to make clear is that what I'm talking about is not in any sense tied to sexuality. And I'm certainly not saying that heterosexual sexuality is somehow necessary for gnosis, although I think it can indeed be an important manifestation of this kind of intimacy. Or on the other hand, it can be a barrier to intimacy, as we know. Of course, we know that there are lots of people who simply are not heterosexual. They don't share this sexual orientation. It's part of their constitutive identity, that they have some other sexual orientation, that they're drawn to other ways of living as sexual beings. And Gnosticism, of course, is generally open to lots of different forms of sexual identity. But ultimately, what I'm saying is it's not really that important about sexual contact. It's about intimacy, right? It's about this sort of intergender intimacy that can be pursued in lots of ways, through friendship, through intellectual exchange, through the kind of connection in which you learn to build mutual networks of care and of exchange of thoughts and ideas and spiritual growth. Men and women learn from each other in a mutual way when they begin to experience this intimacy, which indeed, even when it involves sexuality, even when it does involve heterosexual contact, is in fact something that transcends it, right? It's an intimacy that takes place on the spiritual level and transcends, just merely the physical. So this should make clear, as is important to state, that gender, like other forms of divisions in the material world, are not evil. It's not as if gender is something bad and terrible that we just want to run away from. These sort of divisions are indeed sources of limitation, but ironically, or even paradoxically, the very things that cause the limitations can be sources of the transcendent liberation that can lift us up out of the world defined by divisions and limits, or rather, help us live in that world in a way that sets our spirits free. Right? Just as in another article I'm writing, I'll probably post later this week, the question of suffering. Similarly, suffering is something that we see as to be transcended through gnosis, but at the same time, suffering offers us things. It offers us understanding and compassion towards others. And again, it can make us bitter and angry people, or it can make us much more open to other people. And I think gender is much the same way. It can be a very troubling phenomenon, or it can be something that actually we harness the force of it to help propel us along the spiritual journey in a way that sort of incorporates healing and reconciliation. So ultimately, I think, though, that the pursuit of gender wholeness, that's what we want to call it, is probably even more importantly something that happens within ourselves, that are intragender identities rather than our intergender relationships. When we begin to search for that spiritual memory that Carpocrates talks about, that memory of spiritual wholeness in the pleroma that was later divided through, the shaping of the demiurge, we're really searching to recover within our own beings a wholeness of gender that has been divided and separated within our own experience of life. And it's important to remember here, of course, that demiurgic and archonic forces and pleroma forces are not so much beings or forces that are out there, but there's something operating within us. So in essence, we're looking for something within our own identities. And what we want to do is to move closer to wholeness. And it's this wholeness that is already deep within us, right? As I said, it's imprinted on, as Carpocrates would say, on the spiritual memory that we all possess through the pneuma, through the spirit that's within us. So we want to move closer to that wholeness that is both our ultimate destiny and our earliest origin, to use the words of the Gospel of Philip. We want to gradually help transform our lives and our beings and our existences into the image of that spiritual memory at the heart of the pneuma, the spirit, which is indeed what makes us really human. And what the journey of gnosis is predicated on the notion that even in the midst of this limited material existence, we can begin to transform things and transform ourselves, our bodies, our minds, in a way that infuses them with a new wholeness of the spirit. And thus you see mentioned in that same verse, saying 22 of the Gospel of Thomas, the same kind of thing, that we recreate not only the unity of gender, but it goes on to say these things about, make the hand in the place of a hand, and foot in a place of a foot, and likeness in the place of a likeness. And one way to think of that is that it's talking about this sort of recreation of the self and the image of the spirit. Or, as some have said, through our spirit, we are created in the image of God. And what we need to do through gnosis is to recreate ourselves into the likeness of God. That is to transform the entirety of our being into a full realization of this image of God that's within our deepest human natures. So, in a very real sense, we have already within our spirit a sort of latent inner partnership between things we have called male and female in our experience of the material and intellectual world. And thus, in a very real sense, each of us has within us a sort of inner man and inner woman, what some mystics have spoken of as the animus and the anima. And we must pursue the kind of internal metaphysical partnership that will allow their mutual complementarity to shine forth in our lives and transform our consciousness. And just as we want to revolutionize our relationships externally with regard to gender and the opposite sex, so in parallel, we want to revolutionize our gender relationships internally within our own identities. Now, I think I'm going to stop in a minute, but where I want to go from here is to go on and talk about the story of Sophia and Christ and their relationship to each other, and how they personify a Gnostic theory of gender, both in terms of what we should do towards others, and how we should pursue that wholeness of gender within ourselves. But we see in the stories of Sophia and Christ a great exchange, a great partnership, sort of dialogue that's going on in these stories of cosmic missions, developments in time, and these sort of great forces that represent, in some sense, the feminine and the masculine within the whole unity of the pleroma. So what I want to talk about, I think next week we'll take questions. It'll be the open question day. And then the week after that, what I want to do is I want to go back to the creation myths. But what I want to do is introduce a creation myth that is perhaps a little different and a little more complicated than what you usually have heard, or what we talked about earlier. And that is particularly the creation myth as it was told by the Valentinian Gnostics. Okay, these were the Gnostics that followed Valentinus, the great teacher of the 2nd century. And it's a little more complex. Essentially, it fits with the creation myths of other Gnostic stories. But it has more complexity to it, and particularly with the nature of Sophia and with the nature of Christ and their relationship. And just to give you a taste of what I mean by this, and I'll go into this in more detail in 2 weeks, but what happens to Sophia in this story is that, of course, it starts out the same. She's an eon. She's, in fact, sometimes portrayed as the youngest of the eons. And she goes off by herself, wanting to find out more about her origins and thinking she can attain more knowledge through being alone and thinking on her own. And, of course, this brings about division and separation. And what she produces now in the Valentinian story is not the demiurge immediately, but rather a realm of imperfection, the cosmos, or rather the chaos that is the stuff out of which the demiurge will later create the cosmic world. And what happens in the Valentinian story, and again you'll see how this is different from the simpler Gnostic story, is that this is so traumatic that Sophia actually literally gets split in 2 pieces. And there end up being a higher Sophia who remains an aeon sort of connected fully into the pleroma. But there also emerges a lower Sophia. Part of Sophia's identity becomes trapped in the imperfect realm, becomes trapped in the cosmic chaos. And it tries and tries and tries to get out, and it can't. And what happens is that the demiurge emerges out of the imperfect realm and begins to create all this stuff and eventually creates human beings. And in the Valentinian story, of course, the demiurge thinks it's creating everything on its own, for its own power. But in fact, the lower Sophia, with the help of the eons, is influencing the demiurge, is subtly sort of influencing what he does, and particularly pressing him subtly to the creation of human beings, because the lower Sophia realizes that the only way she can free herself and free the rest of the spirit that's trapped in the cosmic world is if there can emerge some kind of beings that will have a sort of amalgamated identity, that is, that will be part of the cosmic world and part of the spirit world, part cosmos and part pleroma. And this she sees in human beings, right? And so there's sort of a subversion of what the demiurge means to do. He wants to create automatons to worship him, but Sophia wants to create autonomous beings that can achieve liberation. And so it's the lower Sophia then, this Valentinian story, that comes into the form of the serpent, right? The lower Sophia says, all right, I've got to get in contact with the human beings. And so she says, what I'll do is I will go into the humblest and the most simple of physical things, this animal that simply slithers along the ground, the serpent. And the demiurge is so overwhelmed with his own arrogance and his own power that he's not even going to notice something as humble as the serpent. It's just going to be completely off his radar screen. And so the lower Sophia enters the serpent and comes to the people and then has the dialogue in which she begins to tell them the truth about things, which is that as she says, the demiurge is not the one true God, and that in fact human beings have this divine core within them, and if they will have the courage to eat the fruit of moral truth, if they have the courage to face the realities of the universe, or rather of not the universe, but of all existence, then they too can be transformed into gods. I mean, quite literally. But there can be a transformation of the human into the divine. All right? So you can see that story is a bit from the more simple stories, even though I wouldn't say it contradicts, say, like on the origin of the world, but it gives you a different way of looking at it. And what happens then is that the relationship between Christ and Sophia becomes more explicit, because when Christ comes down to earth and manifests in the human being Jesus, Valentinian Gnostics would say, why? I mean, this is a problem. Why does Christ come into the world? I mean, what's the point? And they would say it's to help liberate Sophia, right? It's because Sophia is so important, so fundamental to him in the Pleroma, that he sees the lower Sophia and the rest of the spirit in the cosmic realm, and he wants to enter that world. He wants to be willing to empty himself into a human existence so that he can help bring about the liberation of the lower Sophia and the reunification of the two parts of Sophia, because there's a great pain that's involved in the separation for every being in the Pleroma, because their wholeness has been ripped apart. And so there's very much this sense that Christ and Sophia and all the beings in the Aeon, and God, even God, is deeply moved by compassion. Right? It's compassion that moves all these forces to try to help us. It's compassion and it's suffering. Right? As Origen, an early Christian theologian, said something very interesting. He said, was talking about Jesus Christ, and he says, Christ suffered before he died on the cross. And he says, actually, Christ suffered before he was even born. And he says, if Christ did not suffer, he would never have come down to earth. And that's his explanation of why, Christ sort of enters the world. But anyway, that you can see is tied into this very interesting relationship between Christ and Sophia. So that's what I'll pick up and talk about in 2 weeks. And we'll talk more about some of the other issues of their relationship between the two of them. So I think I'll stop now. And of course, next week, like I said, is the question week. So the third Tuesday.